unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And because it was unconstitutional, because it was unlawful, we, all of us as Americans, whites and blacks, have an obligation to remedy it. Well, that was the book. What the book was about, The Color of Law. As I said, we have an obligation to remedy it, but The Color of Law didn't say much about what we should do to remedy it. I had enough to write in the book without going that far. But people who read the book, and then I gave talks, as Tameika said, all over the country, like here at the Richland Library and elsewhere. And people who read the book and came to my talks frequently asked me, well, okay, it's unconstitutional, it's unlawful, we're glad to know that, but what can we do about it now? And so I figured after hearing that question so many times, I decided I had to try to help them answer it. But, I knew the history. That's what I wrote about in The Color of Law. I wasn't a housing expert. So I had to recruit a housing expert to help me answer that question. I found one in my own family, and I recruited Leah Rothstein, my daughter, to write a book explaining what people can do, blacks and whites together, in their own communities, to minimize, to challenge the segregation that the government unconstitutionally created. The assumption behind our book is that there's no will today at the federal government level to take significant steps to redress segregation. But once you've created a segregated society, local policy sustains and reinforces and magnifies it. So there are so many things that we can do at the local level to redress segregation if we stand up and begin to take action. So that's why I decided I needed to write the book. That's why I asked Leah to collaborate with me, was to answer the question that so many people asked about what we can do about it now.
That is great. And for those of you who haven't read the book, please do read the book. It is a phenomenal book. Before I go, Leah, let me ask you, Richard. So as I read this book and as I hear you talk, it's blacks and whites. It's the community coming together to address, to have this action, to address these issues. But as you mentioned, we live very much in a segregated society. So how do we start those creating the coming together of the groups to start moving forward on a collective action?
Well, you're right, Tameika. That's really the first step that we have to take. We live in a very segregated society. Frequently these days we know people of the other race in our workplaces, but then we go home to segregated neighborhoods and we have very few social relationships with people of other race. We have some, few more than we used to, but still very, very few. And so we don't have the context in which to collaborate to take on these local policies that are creating and reinforcing segregation. So in our book, Just Action, we give some examples of people who've done that. You have to be intentional about it. It just doesn't happen naturally. One example we talk about, and perhaps this can be duplicated in Columbia, we talk about Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where there were 6 Presbyterian churches. 3 were white on the white side of town, all white. 3 were black on the black side of town. All Presbyterian churches, people in the different congregations in the different sides of town had nothing to do with each other. The ministers of those congregations, they knew each other, but had very little to do with each other. But they decided that was an unacceptable way to go forward. So the ministers got together and they created something they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. It was a group of 40 people. The rule of the group was that 20 had to be white, 20 had to be black. If somebody dropped out for whatever reason, they had childcare problems or work obligations, they had to be replaced with somebody of the same race to maintain that racial balance. The group met for a couple of years. They read books together, they studied, they learned the history, and then they began to take action. They got a civilian review board created to prevent police abuse of African Americans. They got the curriculum in the local schools changed so that it was teaching African American history, which it had never done before. That's one example. It was church led. Another example we give in Just Action is a photographer in Chicago, African American photographer, a young woman. Her name has to be Tameika. Tameika Johnson in Chicago. She lived in the Black neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Englewood. Chicago is a very segregated city, like most cities. The south side is Black, the north side is white. She came from the Black side of Chicago. But during the busing period, voluntary busing period, she went to high school on the north side of the city, and so drove through white neighborhoods and noticed how different they were. And so she began to take photographs of identical houses on the north and south sides, each pair of houses equally distant from downtown. One was Black, one was white. She called them map twins. And she knocked on their doors and asked them if they'd like to meet their map twin. And they did, and they began to develop these relationships. They had no idea they had so much in common with people living in different houses, but very similar houses on opposite sides of town. Most of them never been to the other side of town. Whites were told never go there. More African Americans had come north to work in restaurants or hotels, but still very little contact. And they developed, eventually they got their neighbors together, they developed block twins and began to relate to each other. And that creates a basis as well. They began to educate themselves. Other groups have begun to educate themselves about the history of their own community, because every community's history is very similar, but also unique. And the history will give you ideas about places to start to redress segregation in your own community. It just so happens that 2 weeks ago, an author named David Nicholson published a book called The Garretts of Columbia, a Black South Carolina family from slavery to the dawn of integration. He's a professional writer. It's well written. It's probably a good place to start to learn the history of race in Columbia, South Carolina. But that's the way we have to start, get to know people of the other race, and then educate ourselves about the community. And from that point on, we can begin to take action. And there are so many things that we can do in our local community to redress segregation once we have the motivation, the interracial relationships, and the knowledge of our community's history to begin to do it.
Wow, great. Lee, okay, there was another idea. So our next project, that sounds like a great place to start. So Leah, before you and I came up here, we were talking about from the policy standpoint. And so can you give us, as a housing expert, from your experience, what are some of the local policies that can be advocated for to challenge the segregation? And out of those, can you give us some examples on maybe where you've seen it work really well or things that may not work as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. So our entire book is examples of policies, local policies and strategies that groups like my dad described that come together, biracial, multi-ethnic groups, educated about the history of their own community, then could start to take action to affect change. So there's dozens of examples. There's no sort of right way for each community to start because every community is different, and all of these strategies and policies, will have an impact on remedying segregation. And so it kind of doesn't matter where we start, just that we start somewhere. And so just as an overview of what we talk about in Just Action in terms of these policies and strategies, they're all local. So all things we can achieve on the local level, either through local city councils, county boards of supervisors, or local institutions, companies, banks that can enact these programs. And then we sort of cover strategies and policies that do two things, because to redress segregation, we need to look to the future to ensure that we're not continuing to create segregated neighborhoods or perpetuate, maintain the segregation that exists. And then we also have to look to the past, because for the example my dad gave about the suburbanization of the country and the wealth gap that exists, we can't sort of expect to remedy segregation without addressing the disparities that exist from past government policies. So we have to have strategies that also attempt to repair some of that harm. So both forward and past looking strategies. And then we group them into two main categories. The first category is those policies and strategies that aim to increase resources and investments in segregated African American neighborhoods, where the concentration of poverty is a result of government-sponsored segregation, and then the government divesting in those areas, taking out investments and resources. So we want to make those areas of higher investment, higher opportunity, better resources, better well-resourced public schools and access to open space and parks and clean air and grocery stores and banks. We also understand that when areas like that, when segregated lower income areas become, start to see increased investment, often what happens is gentrification that then occurs. People with higher incomes want to move in. Landlords see an opportunity and they try to displace or kick out their lower paying tenants so they can get higher paying tenants in. So we need to sort of couple those strategies with anti-displacement efforts. So one example that falls into this category that does both of these things, increasing investment, housing opportunities, and preventing displacement, is a land trust. I don't believe that there's a land trust here in Columbia. They're nonprofit organizations. There's over 300 communities around the country that have a land trust. It's a terrific model for creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities, which are hard to create, permanently affordable homes that people can buy. So how it does it is a land trust forms and acquires vacant or unused property, usually through a local government. So we write about in Durham, North Carolina, the Durham Community Land Trust started when residents of a sort of under-resourced, segregated African-American neighborhood just started going door to door and talking to their neighbors about how to improve their neighborhood. The first thing that they worked on was wanting to get a vacant lot turned into a park. And they advocated for that with the city and they won. So then they were excited and, starting to see, oh, what else can we do in our neighborhood? Their neighborhood was gentrifying. So they learned about the land trust model and they started a land trust and got 2 vacant properties donated by the city to their land trust. So cities all over the country, city and county governments are sitting on vacant land that they could donate to a land trust to be used in this way. But it takes community members, residents, voters advocating that the city use its vacant land that way. So another way that people can be involved in a campaign to support a land trust. So then the land trust, it fixed up these 2 properties and sold them at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. It sold them for $100,000 in today's money, which is pretty affordable for a home. And then what happens in the land trust model is those homeowners own the home like any other homeowner. They pay their taxes, mortgage, insurance. When they want to resell the home, they adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes. Every land trust does it slightly differently based on some equation that allows the home selling family to earn some equity in the sale, but not as much as if they were selling it for market rate prices, because in turn they ensure that the home price for the next home buying family is affordable. So that's how it continues to be an affordable home ownership opportunity forever. So the Durham Land Trust now has over 300 properties all over Durham. The neighborhoods where it was able to acquire properties in this gentrifying area are still predominantly African American. And the homes now sell for $150,000, which is slightly less affordable because of that equation. But the surrounding homes sell for $500,000, so far more affordable than the market. And the homes where the land trust wasn't able to acquire property as fast as investors, most of the residents are now white. The longtime residents have been displaced. So it's a very effective sort of anti-displacement and affordable housing strategy. So that's one example. We can support land trusts in our communities, help start one, help advocate that our local governments donate to a land trust. We can also advocate that our local institutions and companies in the community, many of which, if they've been here long enough or acquired older companies, had a part to play in the segregation of our communities. So we can research that history, find out who had a role to play in segregating the community, and then sort of demand that they live up to their obligation to remedy some of that segregation. And one way they could do that is through a land trust. So that's one example from our first category, one category of strategies that we discussed. And then the other category is strategies for opening up exclusive, expensive, often suburban, predominantly white communities to more diverse residents. So we have to do both of these things to truly redress segregation, both equally important. So ways to do that are through like zoning reform to not allow these suburban communities to limit the amount of housing that is built in those communities, and thereby keeping the housing prices in those areas high and pricing out anyone but the most affluent, often white families. That's one of the ways suburban areas have remained segregated and white, by ensuring that sort of smaller houses or multifamily homes or townhomes or more affordable homes can't be built there through zoning. So a lot of communities are changing their zoning. It's called single family only zoning, that only will allow one house per lot in those areas. So they're rezoning or upzoning those areas to get rid of single family only zoning to allow a more diverse range of housing types in those communities. Another way of helping opening up access to more to these sort of higher cost areas is through the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program. So this is an extremely important program all around the country. It's the biggest rental subsidy program for lower income renters in the country. 2 million low income tenants, families get a Section 8 voucher. It helps them rent a unit in the private market. It's not tied to a public housing building, for example. They can use that voucher to rent anywhere in the private market. And when the program was established, it had the intention and the promise to allow lower income tenants the ability to move out of high poverty areas. So they could use this voucher, move to what's called a high opportunity area, where they have access to well-resourced public schools and jobs, clean air, help those kids sort of thrive in higher opportunity areas by giving the family a voucher to move out of the high poverty, more segregated areas. But only 5% of voucher holders around the country are able to do that. So most people with a Section 8 voucher can only use that voucher in these high poverty areas, and they're limited to staying in what's called low opportunity areas. And so in order for the Section 8 program to live up to its potential, there's some things that we can do to change certain aspects of the Section 8 program that are locally controlled. So one is that there is the federal government allows landlords to discriminate against people who use Section 8 to pay their rent. It's an allowed form of discrimination nationally, but hundreds of localities and about 20 states have passed laws called source of income discrimination laws or ordinances that make that kind of discrimination illegal. So currently there are none of those laws in this state, but there is a bill that was just introduced. I don't know that most bills get through the first time they're introduced, but there is talk, there's movement. And so that would make this kind of discrimination illegal all around the state. So that's another way that people interested in these issues could advocate that their state senators support passing that bill and support a source of income discrimination law. Another aspect of the Section 8 program is just how it's designed. It's designed to have a maximum voucher amount that makes over half of the rents in a jurisdiction too expensive for that voucher to support. So I'll just break that down really quickly. So for how the federal government sets a maximum voucher amount is it takes a metropolitan area, the full range of the rents in that metropolitan area, takes the middle rent, so the middle rent between the lowest and the highest, 10% below that is the maximum rent a voucher holding tenant can afford. So by definition, 60% of the rents in that jurisdiction, in that metropolitan area, are out of reach to voucher holders. So it's not surprising that they can't use their vouchers to live in higher cost areas because it's cost prohibitive. The design of the program makes it impossible. So there have been some changes since the program was established because of this aspect of how the voucher amount is set. It it limits voucher holders to living in segregated high poverty areas. So some areas are now required to set the voucher amount based on the median rent of a smaller area of that metropolitan region. So instead of the middle rent of the whole region, it's a middle rent of a zip code or a group of zip codes. So in higher cost areas of a metro region, a voucher will pay more than in lower cost areas. And that allows for a lot more mobility of voucher holders to live where they want, to have more options. Starting in 2025, there's going to be, HUD just added about 40 new metro areas that are required to use these smaller area rents. So in 2025, there will be 65 metropolitan regions around the country required to use these small area rents. There are, I believe, 3 in South Carolina, but Columbia is not in one of them. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to be done here either, because public housing authorities that aren't required to use the small area rent standard can adopt that voluntarily. They can decide, we're going to make our voucher worth more in higher cost areas of our city or county and less in lower cost areas, which is a logical way of running a program. But most public housing authorities, even though they have the ability to adopt this change voluntarily, they need some public pressure to get them there, to convince them that that's what the community wants and needs. And so that's another way that a local group could get involved in sort of challenging segregation that happens through the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. So those are a couple examples. I can obviously talk forever about more of them, but I'll stop now.
I mean, those are some great examples, and I'm taking notes because you really hit home that there's a lot of things that can be done, but it really starts with advocacy. Well, first of all, it starts with people knowing that these are things that could be suggested and proposed and then advocated for. So I love that. I wanted to go back to one thing and just say, so Leah talked about Durham and the success of the land trust. And one of the things through my work with the National League of Cities, I also realized that areas like this, that things work well, they have multiple things. So Durham was a city that I studied when I introduced the Child Savings Account program. They have a really great Child Savings Account program in Durham. They also had some programs specifically designed to address the racial wealth gap. And so it really was the leadership in that city said, these are some issues that we have, and how can we come up with strategies from the government side that empower our communities to then address these issues. And so I love that, because that land trust, when, as people hear that, they probably like, oh, that just sounds nearly impossible. But it really is not. I mean, Booker Washington Heights is a great neighborhood to potentially start with the land trust. And so those are some things we'd love to talk about. Let me bring in Richard a little bit on this conversation, because one of the things, again, that I definitely see the effects of here in Columbia when we look at the history and the policies that government did was redlining. And you mentioned the banks not lending in certain areas. And we hear a whole lot here about our food deserts. and part of my district, my Senate district, and a big part of the city of Columbia is an area 29203. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the statistics of 29203, this area certainly is a food desert, high poverty levels, high health disparities. It is the zip code nationally, not just in the state of South Carolina, but nationally, that has the highest rate of hypertension and diabetes, particularly amputations due to diabetes. And so, but when we did this conversation with your dad a couple years ago, we had USC, the Center for, I don't know what it's called, Bobby Donaldson. Y'all know Dr. Donaldson. Civil rights. He was able to pull for us the Columbia Red Line maps. And when you look at the red line and everything else, it is this area that we are now seeing these issues. So I'd love to hear, Richard, from your standpoint. I think these are certainly natural effects of the redlining and the bank policies. But to that aspect, what are you seeing that how can you address some of those things? Because those did add to the racial wealth gap, but not just the racial wealth gap, but these health disparities and long-term life expectancy issues that communities of color are experiencing.
Well, sure. It's part of the same program. The redlining is a term that originally developed from maps that the Homeowners Loan Corporation developed, a New Deal agency in the 1930s, that indicated where the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration should not. It wasn't a prohibition, but it was an indication of where they should not insure mortgages because Negroes might live there. And it also, it also prohibited mortgages, as I indicated earlier, in suburban communities. So African Americans could get mortgages in neither place, neither in the places that were drawn red on the maps, where some were already living, or in places that were drawn, they were drawn green on the maps, which were these suburban areas that were from which African Americans were excluded. Well, but there were many, many other policies that were followed, all of which reinforced segregation. The result is that if African Americans wanted to buy a home and they couldn't get them in white neighborhoods, if they wanted to buy a home even in a black neighborhood, frequently speculators came in. And since they couldn't get conventional mortgages or FHA insured mortgages, the speculators did something like sold them on contract, which meant that they gave them a home. They made monthly payments. The families thought they were getting a mortgage. They thought these were what ordinary people did when they bought a home. They made monthly payments, but in fact, they gained no equity. They had no rights to the home. Their names weren't on the deeds, on the titles. And at a point in time, the speculators would kick them out and sell them to a new homeowner, get a new down payment, and the sale prices were much, much higher than market rates. Well, if you go into the deeds of these homes and the records of these kinds of speculations, you can identify the banks and sometimes the speculators, the developers, who practice this kind of discrimination. If you go into the deed clauses, the restrictive covenants that were also placed on homes, preventing sales to anybody but a white family, anybody but a Caucasian family. You can identify the banks, the realtors, the developers who built those homes. We give a number of examples in Just Action of groups such as the ones I described before, groups that got together, started to research their communities, and uncovered all of the racial deeds, the clauses that prohibited resale to anything but Caucasians, and looked at those deeds and identified the banks, the realtors, the developers. We profile a group in Charlottesville, Virginia, who did that. We profile a group in Rochester, New York, that did that. We profile a group in the South Bay of San Francisco that did that. One in Modesto, California, that did that. And they can identify the banks and the realtors that still exist in that community today that were responsible for segregating that community. Well, a local group should begin a pressure campaign against those banks and those realtors that still exist today to make amends for the segregation that they created. And that doesn't mean dimes or nickels. That means substantial contributions that are necessary to make a significant step towards redressing the segregation that they created. So as Leah said before, we can, at a local level, press for local ordinances, state legislation that can redress segregation, but there's also an enormous role for direct action against the private sector businesses that created the segregation, that are identifiable, still exist in the community today, and have an obligation to participate in the remedy for the wrongs that they did.
Thank you. So I have two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So y'all start thinking about what questions that you all have for Richard and Leah. But my first one, my second to last question is, I know in the book we talk about affordable housing and we talk about home ownership. But I know there's been over the last few years, and I think probably people shy of because of the housing market and '08 and that kind of thing. So some folks have kind of gone away from home ownership. And I love in the book when you talk about, is home ownership the answer? And so this is kind of a two-part question. But Leah, tell us, what do you think as far as, and what are you seeing as far as home ownership being the answer, but also around affordable housing? Because I am someone who still uses that term because I feel like we have to normalize the term affordable housing. But I know there are some people who don't like affordable, so they call it attainable and market or they workforce. So there's all kinds of names. To me, it is a house that people can afford to live in. But what are you seeing as far as affordable housing, the development of affordable housing, and is homeownership still a viable option to help us address some of these policies?
Okay, I'll start with the affordable housing question. So we have the sort of unfortunate trend or belief that affordable housing in this country is just refers to housing that's affordable to the lowest income or the most poor people. Really, the definition of affordable housing is that you're not paying more than 30% of your income on your rent. Now, I just saw a study today that said that over half of renters in the country are paying more than 30%. So most people in this country are not living in affordable housing. So when we talk about affordable housing, when we talk about it in Just Action, we're not talking about, we're including housing that's affordable to very low income people, but we're also including housing that's affordable to middle income people, and especially when we're talking about housing for African American families to desegregate areas and redress the harms of segregation. Most African American families are not poor. They're middle income families that fall into what's called this missing middle group, that make too much to qualify for subsidized low income housing and too little to afford market rate housing. So when we talk about affordable housing, it's a broader term that includes housing that's affordable for whatever you're making. And so we need to focus our efforts not only on low income housing and on where we place that low income housing, so that it's not only in areas of high poverty, but also in areas of high opportunity, so that we're sort of allowing more diversity of people and incomes and housing types in all kinds of neighborhoods. But we also want to be focusing on housing that's affordable to this middle income group. And that is not what's getting a lot of attention right now. And it's understandable. There's limited, public funds to support building affordable housing. So it's focused on the most needy. But it's not going to sort of get us out of this housing unaffordability crisis or help us redress segregation if we're not also looking at middle income housing and the sort of broad need for affordable housing and where we put it. So to add to that, we also advocate very strongly for building mixed income housing, so that when we're investing in housing in our communities, it should include housing for the very poor and the middle income and market rate housing, so that we're not creating segregation in the buildings that we build. Those buildings themselves should be integrated economically and racially. So there's that piece. And there's a lot of ways of increasing how we build affordable housing. There's the public subsidies for building it. There's changing zoning. It sort of helps produce what's called naturally occurring affordable housing by allowing smaller units, smaller houses to be built, more than one per lot. So duplexes, triplexes. It's sort of a more naturally affordable housing than if it was one big house on a big lot. So there's a lot of different ways of approaching the affordable housing need. Now for home ownership, when you ask, is home ownership the answer? And I think you're referring to, is home ownership the answer for addressing the racial wealth gap and addressing these disparities that we're talking about and sort of redressing the harms of segregation and discrimination? And I would say that it is an answer. It's not the answer. Just like sort of everything we talk about, there's many solutions and many pieces to the puzzle, and we need them all eventually, but no one of them is going to be the only way we get to the goals, you know, the sort of what we hope to see. And there's a lot of reasons, you know, like my dad described, when home ownership was being promoted by the federal government for whites, homes were affordable, and they are no longer affordable to working class families. So it's not sort of the golden ticket to building wealth that it once was. There's also a lot of ways that home ownership doesn't build wealth the same way for African Americans as it does for whites. So we need to address all of those obstacles to the wealth building potential of home ownership for Black homeowners if we want home ownership to be an answer to this puzzle. So for example, in communities all across the country, homeowners in African American communities are paying more in property taxes relative to the value of their homes than homeowners in white communities. And I can get into this if anyone's interested. Yeah, okay. So everybody, you know, who owns property pays property taxes. Those property taxes fund your public services, and they're supposed to be spread equitably across all property owners based on the value of your home. You pay a percentage that's applied to the value of your home. So that if you have a high value home, you pay more in property taxes than if you have a low value home. But how does the county determine what the value of your home is? Because you only really know the value of your home when it's sold. So the county tax assessor will do an assessed value, will determine what the assessed value of your home is. It's supposed to be as close to the true market value as possible. But what happens is they'll do a countywide assessment. And in many communities around the country, they don't do a reassessment for decades. And we write about this in Just Action. Some cities haven't done a reassessment for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So if they're not doing a true reassessment in those many, many years, they're doing an annual adjustment to that assessed value that they decide, we think this year values went up by this percent or went down by this percent. And it's the same adjustment countywide. But what really happens to home values, as you know, there's this old assessed value with an annual adjustment. In white communities, those home values have skyrocketed. They've gotten, you know, they've risen a lot faster than those annual adjustments. And in African American and segregated communities of color, those homes haven't risen in value as fast. So their actual market value is closer to their assessed value. So if you think about it now, so the white families are paying property taxes on an assessed value that's way below their true market value, while Black homeowners are paying taxes on an assessed value that's closer to their market value. So as a result, Black homeowners are overpaying in property taxes relative to white homeowners. And this is happening all over the country. Another local issue that we can find out, you know, how, to what extent it's happening in our own communities, and then advocate that our county tax assessor changes their policies to do reassessments more often. And we could go a step further. And if we find that these disparities have existed for a long time, demand that those families, those Black families who've been overpaying in property taxes for decades, get some refund or some remedy for that unfair assessment over the years. Now, there, I can, well, I'll get to it. At the end, we'll have some links up. And one of them is to our Substack column, where we're continuing to write about these issues. It's a free column. You can subscribe. It comes to your inbox. In one of those columns, I just gave sort of a list of resources for people wanting to get deeper into the issues that we talk about. So one is a resource that will help you start a land trust. It's a sort of technical assistance nonprofit that helps land trusts all around the country called Grounded Solutions. Another is a project, I think it was out of, I forget which university, a professor has a database of all the property tax levels all in counties all around the country. You can put in your county and see what the disparities are. And then you can use that data to start a campaign and advocate for change in your local area. So to get back to the homeownership question, that's one reason why homeownership for Blacks is not the same wealth building potential as for whites, because if you're paying more in property taxes every year, you can't build the same amount of wealth through your home ownership as you can if you're underpaying in property taxes. So that's just one issue. There's many more, but again, sort of this theme of there's all of these pieces of the puzzle, and we have to be mindful of, addressing all of them if we really want to see a redress of segregation, equitable housing. So yes, homeownership, increasing homeownership for African Americans is an important piece of the puzzle. We won't sort of close the wealth gap without that. So we need down payment assistance programs. We need to reform the credit scoring system. We need, home ownership education and counseling programs in Black communities. And then we also need to address all of these other issues like the property tax system and home appraisals. And so there's a lot to do.
And my last question is for both of you. And so, of course, the Color of Law was written. There was a racial reckoning in this country. It seemed like the pendulum was swinging towards people acknowledging that racism is still an issue in this country, and that we have work to do. And then the last few years, it seems like the pendulum is swinging back. And I would say slowly, but it's really not, kind of boomeranging back to where I think that folks are very, I'm now a politician again, so I'm trying to be politically correct. But people are very out front and overt about racism. And going back, I think, to wanting to use policies, maybe not to segregate America, but to segregate the races and keep people down. And so I'm kind of wondering from you all, as you've been touring with this book and talking about communities coming together and addressing these, have you seen and felt a backlash? And are you still hopeful that communities can come together around these policies to really be thoughtful about addressing this together?
Yeah, I'll start and then you can go, Dad. I think he's looking at me there. Yeah, so our book came out in June, and since then I've been traveling around the country speaking to groups like this about the book, and I'm happy to say I'm still hopeful. Writing the book, I wasn't sure what we would find, if we would find that there actually are solutions, because segregation feels like almost an impossible problem to solve, or that's what it felt before I started working on this book. And in writing the book, I found that there's actually so much that can be done, so many attainable changes that are local, and so pretty attainable, pretty feasible if a local group was organized and activated. And then for each of the strategies and policies, the ones I described and all of the rest in the book, we give an example of a community that's been working on it or successfully implemented that strategy. So it is happening all over the country. And then in talking to people about the book around the country, there's appetite. People are hungry for knowing what to do. There's sort of this backlash nationwide, but in communities locally around the country, people want to know how to make change and how to do something different to sort of turn the tide back towards doing the right thing. And I think that, I hope that this book gives some ideas of how to do that. I don't pretend to say or imagine that it's going to be easy, because it won't. Organizing change, social change, civil rights movements are difficult work, and there's always backlash. It never just sort of happens. And so I do think that there is a lot happening around the country that we just don't know about, because it's sort of smaller efforts in local communities, but they have a lot of impact, and I hope that they'll build and sort of build a momentum around the country to counter the other sort of forces at play right now. Do you have something to add?
Sure. Tameika, you can't have a backlash unless there's something to lash back at. And the only reason we have a backlash is because people are advocating racial justice in a way that we never have before. We're a deeply polarized country. There's no question about it. But if we weren't making progress, there wouldn't be a backlash to it because there'd be nothing to backlash to. There are some states that are trying, as you know, to restrict how teachers teach about the real history of racial injustice, about slavery, about Jim Crow. When I was growing up in the 1940s and 50s, nobody was trying to prevent people from teaching that. They didn't have to. Nobody was teaching it. The reason that they're trying to prevent it now is because people actually are teaching it. And that's enormous progress. Now, it's true that the opponents of racial justice have become much more vocal. That doesn't mean they've become more numerous. It means they've become more vocal. 20 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder in 2020. 20 million Americans, the largest outpouring for racial justice in this nation's history. And those 20 million people were white and black, they were suburban and urban, they were young and old. It was the most diverse in every way outpouring for racial justice that we've ever seen. Well, one of the problems is that those people, and maybe there's some of them in Columbia, South Carolina, participated in such demonstrations and then went home, put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns, and did nothing further. And we wrote this book in part because we think the reason they did nothing further is because they didn't know what to do and nobody asked them to do anything. And so our purpose in writing this book is to assume that there's an enormous base of support for racial justice, but it doesn't know what to do. And we need to make more current the ideas about all the opportunities there are to make progress, in the same way that the color of law made more current the idea that we live in an unconstitutional system of segregation.
Wonderful. That's all righty. So now we want to open it up to you all, our audience. So if anyone has any questions, do you want to?
Yeah, we can bring up the mic.
Okay. All right, this lady right here.
Good evening, friends. My name is Deborah DePauli. I work with Institute for Child Success. Starting in the fall of 22, we did an assessment of our community partners and family advocates, specifically focused on what were the barriers keeping young children and their families from reaching their full potential. The second thing in the list, after we'd done all our research, was access to safe, stable, affordable housing. Since then, we've been looking for ways to address this. One of the things that concerns me, and you touched on it, about home ownership. I live in Richland School District 2. My children attend very respected schools, desirable schools. I bought the house 17 years ago, and my mortgage is $950. I had a phone conversation today with a mom, Latina mom, just came here seeking asylum, 3 children, living in Richland 1 and Lower Richland, so other schools that are not maybe as desirable. She just moved into a 3-bedroom trailer and is paying $1,100 a month. $1,100 a month. I haven't been to her home yet, but I've been to a lot of trailers in Lower Richland. I know that the schools her children are attending don't have the same report cards that the schools that my children attend have achieved. That to me is beyond shocking and deplorable. True, homeownership is not the only solution, all the things you talked about and many, many more. What I feel HUD Housing has done on a long-term basis has been to basically subsidize landlords, right? Because landlords are getting that money every month and they're developing equity. A family who maybe is blessed to move, no longer qualify for HUD housing because they've started to earn a little bit more. They move out of that place where they lived for 10 or 15 years and they walk away with zero equity, nothing. And I'm not saying that the value of living in that home for 15 years was nothing. It was substantial. But who ends up with their pocket or their bank account enriched? It was the homeowners. So I don't have a question so much just as a, oh my gosh, we need to fix this now.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that. So another little known fact about the Section 8 program is that Section 8 vouchers can be used towards a mortgage. There's a Section 8 homeownership program that housing authorities can voluntarily adopt to use, where Section 8 tenants can use their voucher instead of towards rent, towards a mortgage. Very few housing authorities have that program. Again, they need to be pressured to do it. It's more difficult. Their staff knows the rental market better than the homeownership market. There's all sorts of reasons they don't do it, but they can, and many do. And so that's a way that those programs can be used to not just enrich a landlord, but help that family build equity and have a long time, a permanent home. So that's one answer to your question. And yes, I agree that home ownership, if we're talking about building wealth and stability, home ownership is the answer. But not everybody is going to be a homeowner. So we have to also have rental strategies. And I sort of glossed over because there was so much to say about home ownership, but there's a lot of strategies, a lot of things we can do to help increase opportunity for home ownership, especially for African-American home buyers. One example is just down payment assistance programs. And we describe a couple in Just Action of individuals, one connected to a business, a real estate business, one not, who just decided they wanted to address this issue and started down payment assistance programs where they raise money and give grants to Black and Hispanic home buyers to help them buy homes. And it does, they learned about the history. Both of them, I interviewed both of them, and they read The Color of Law. They learned about this history, and they saw the wealth gap, how it resulted from this past government policy, and how we can never sort of solve the issues in our society around racial disparities unless we address that wealth gap. And one way to do that is to help the people who don't have access to intergenerational wealth because of our past government policies that kept Black families out of home ownership, and give them grants for a down payment on a home so that they can become homeowners even without that access to intergenerational wealth and inheritances. They're doing that. They're successful. They're raising money. They're giving grants. They're helping families get into their first homes. That's another thing we can support or help start. Realtors, often people are asked what realtors can do to help change and fix the problems that they helped create. And one is realtors could donate a fraction of their commissions towards a down payment assistance fund that could do this very same thing. So there's, a lot of things we could do and pressure those around us to do to start making change around these issues.
Good evening, and thank you so much. I read your book in graduate school, and the rest was history. And it has everything to do with this question. Hi, my name is China. I want to thank you also for leaning into the abundance frame, that there are endless possibilities and that there are solutions out there in our community. My friends and I are very interested in starting like a small investment group, right? We're all under 40, we're African American, and we're really leaning into, especially following the money. All these banks are buying up land, they're buying up homes, and making it extremely difficult for anyone to even begin to start that, right? At the very end, you started kind of addressing it, but we're torn. I'm familiar with the West Side Community Land Trust in Charlotte, North Carolina, and visited. And I'm torn between that Black tax, essentially, of how do we address all of these things that your books outline, but then also how do we build wealth for our generations and the generation to come after us? Have you seen models that kind of hold both in their hand? for those of us who are very interested in doing things like buying the block and making sure we give back to community, while also making sure that we have wealth to pass down to our sons and daughters. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The land trust, yes, it doesn't build the same amount of wealth for the homeowners as if they were selling, they could sell their home for any price, you know, because there's that limited equity arrangement. But they do build some wealth, depending on how the land trust establishes that equation for the maximum resale price. They usually all try to balance, you know, the desire for the home selling family to build some wealth with the need to create, to maintain the affordability of that home. So there is some wealth building potential in the land trust model, but it's limited. So it's not the answer that everybody wants, understandably. I think down payment assistance is a way that, you know, it gets people into a home that's not then restricted in how they can resell it afterwards, but it brings the price of that home down to a level that they can afford. There's sort of revolving loan funds that help build housing that then require a level of affordability in that housing in exchange for the loan with a lower interest rate. Often those are public funds. So there are ways, there's always, you know, trade-offs in all of this. If you're putting money into creating affordable housing, there's a trade-off between, are you trying to create, or is your main priority creating wealth through that housing, or is it creating permanently affordable housing? That's always going to be a trade-off. You have to sort of balance those two because you can't do both with the same amount of money. You could allow in a land trust the home sellers to sell at market rate, but then you'd have to resubsidize the home every time. So it is tricky that way. Do you have anything to add, Dad?
Well, just something in a broader context. You know, I don't want to give a misleading impression, and Leah doesn't either, that we can solve all these problems quickly. It's going to take a long, long time. And frequently, the only way we're going to make progress is by starting very small and letting small victories build into larger ones. We can't start with the biggest problems first. And as we said at the very beginning of this meeting, we can't start it with African Americans alone. We need a biracial movement because African Americans do not have the political power in this country alone to make these kinds of changes. So we need a biracial movement. We need to start small. The purpose of the reason we wrote Just Action the way we did is we wanted to give so many different examples of things to start with that you can start anywhere. Pick one that seems easiest for you to accomplish. And I think what you'll find is that when you win small victories, they'll build towards larger ones, give you more confidence, give you more experience, and you'll be able to build larger ones. So the problem you're describing is very, very real, but it might not be the place you can start. Maybe you have to start a little bit smaller and build towards it and get the strength to be able to make these bigger changes.
Thank you all. And I'm sorry, we have time for one more question because we are over, but you jumped up first. So yes, sir.
So he can hear you.
Well, all right. My question is primarily focusing on those of us who have homes now. That's becoming even more of a problem in many communities because a lot of us are losing our homes, and not just us, white folks too. You know, and in my mind, it just seems to me that there are a whole bunch of pieces that need to be put together. Education is one. I mean, right now there should be all kinds of these little groups established with you presiding, Senator, yes, and giving us an opportunity to really hear what the truth is. I think so many of us have been in the cloud, you know, walking around thinking that we know what we're doing, and we really don't know what we're doing. Because the same powers that established the segregation issue is the same powers that's trying to change it. That's how I perceive it. And I just really do believe that, you know, this advocacy and doing more, but exposing exposing an opportunity for us to have some voice in it, to be able to say something like I'm doing right now. You know, I think a lot of folks in this room got a lot of questions, but they're just not ready to ask those questions right now. But I think an opportunity, whenever we're given the opportunity to have the chance to listen and hear what the truth is, because there's a lot of lies going on out there. And we get tricked all the time. But, you know, that's not the point here. I mean, what we're trying to do is establish and begin a process that can make people feel good about life. And I just think, you know, what you're doing is we're moving in the right direction, but we just need more of it. And education. I mean, right now, there are people in there struggling to keep their homes right now. And I think that there needs to be a little focus on trying to maintain them, educating them, giving them an opportunity to understand what they can get and what they can't get. Not only in the home, but before you move in the home. I think like a lot of people are going in with these visions of grandeur, you know, thinking that, you know, it's lollipop time. It's not lollipop time. This is serious business. This is the rest of your life. I'm 77 years old, see, and I've been around. I mean, I've seen a lot of stuff in them 77 years. And I'm still saying to myself right now, you know, there are some things that need to be done that should have been done. That should have been done. I mean, we you know, a lot of this stuff we talking about, you know, I mean, it needs to be taken care of. We can go on from now until the end of time trying to put this together. I've been here 77 years and I ain't seen no changes in segregation. Segregation is what it is because that's what they wanted it to be. The powers that be. And there's always going to be the powers that be, whether we want to admit it or not. And I just wanted to say that, and I really do appreciate the two of you because I'm going to read this book. I'm going to read it. But thank you.
Great, thank you.
You'll give me an opportunity.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, we're out of time. So Kevin, I know you had a question. Maybe Leah will answer it afterwards. But I want to get us out of here and thank the library so much for hosting us. I'm gonna I'm gonna give Leah and Richard the last word. But what I will say is that exactly what the title of this book is just action. You know, we're happy that you're here and listening, but we don't want to leave here without action. And so Leah and Richard are going to give us some resources, but I am here. I'm going to stick around. We will, to this gentleman's point, have more conversation. Education and knowledge is power. And we'll look at ways that we can do something so that when there is a book number 3, Columbia might be a model that they are talking about as they're saying what communities have done. So I thank you both so much, and I'm going to give you both the last word.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming and being here and engaged. Just so there will be a few links up here as it cycles through, just to let you know what they are. One is for our website about the book and our appearances, and you can learn more about the book and share it with your people and see where we're going to be and come hear us talk or send your folks out. And then we have the Substack column, justaction.substack.com. You can subscribe for free. Again, there's a resources article in there, and there's a lot more of articles about various aspects of what we wrote about in Just Action, updates, new issues that we didn't get to in the book, and success stories. And then the last link is to the Redress Movement, which is a national organization, fairly new, that was born out of the interest in the color of law to put organizers in communities around the country to work on campaigns to redress segregation. And you can sign up to hear more about the Redress Movement through the link up there, redressmovement.org/justaction. And I'll just wrap up by saying we've said this over and over, but you know, the gentleman is right that little has changed around segregation in, you know, since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So in 50 plus years, 60, 70 years, little has changed. But that's not a reason to not do anything about it now. It doesn't mean that we can't start making those changes now. And so it is sort of, it is an overwhelming, seemingly unchangeable issue, but we hope that we give enough ideas and just action to show that it's not actually, it doesn't have to be that way. We can start to make these changes. They are happening in communities around the country, and it's our obligation and to make those changes and to redress the harms that our government has enacted by past policies. It's our obligation. We can do it, and it's time to just get started. So that's where I'll end. To you, Dad. He can't see me. Can you hear me? Do you have anything you want to say?
Oh, me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm just, you know, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to young people like the young man of 77 who just asked the last question. It's the technology gives me the ability to be with you, even though I'm not able to be there in person. I've been around for a long time. I've seen a lot of progress. I've seen some steps back, but I've learned over the course of my life that progress can be made if people get off their chairs and do it. It doesn't come from the top, it comes from the bottom up. And that's the way we'll see continued progress. And I'm hoping that you will be part of that future and ongoing movement to make the progress that we need. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody for being here. A couple of notes. We're gonna move Leah over to the signing table so you can have your book signed that you received tonight. Thanks to the Friends and